私のドッキングチェアを使っていいよ。よーく見ておくといい。覚えたわよ。交渉は終わりです。掃除対象ロックオン。お披露目だ。生きて歌え。僕の名も神月が来る。これこそが知恵の伝道。
多少は価値があったよ。つまらん攻撃だ。
防衛モード起動。殲滅モード。フォークを叩く。今宵月を捧ぐ。
人生でもっと学べなかったのか。
君に刺さ絶縁障壁移して。知識はあなたにも。交渉は終わりです。流れて開幕。防衛モード全部丸見えね。
お前は囚人だ。
や手をつなぎな。掃除対象光の移して。
その弱虫で傷つけられるのか。
や魔が出てきそう。
臭い世界に妥協するというのか。
痛がっちゃいないの。糸よ工作せよ。
ガンのように羽ばたけ。世界を熱狂の渦に。
少しいいかい。
オラオラ
宙に浮いてればやられない。
寒いから気をつけろよ。
かかれ。
終わりね。せっかじゃーん。平穏調理。はっよっやったり。キングとクイーンは一緒じゃない。歌え僕の名のもとに。最高の一品よ。
そう糸よ工作せよ。捕まえた。残念。
お披露目だ。よっ振るんじゃダメ。霊装の時間よ。光り輝くがいい。終わりね。
一発で十分よ。痛がっちゃいない。
目の下も満足させてあげる。
恐れなくていいさ。罪に向き合う。逃げるな。
オラオラそりゃ
捕まえた。糸よ
俺より
工作せよ。
は断罪の人
世界の熱狂の渦に。
効果も大切よ。
少しいいかい。
またそれ外れたの。
どうするよそりゃ
いってらっしゃい。
よっ
終わりね。撤収。僕をたたえよ。はっ歌え僕の名のもとに。ガンのように羽ばたけ。食
クイーンよダンスといこう。
ステップは覚えているわよね。
オラオラ
舞台はまだ終わってない
お披露
わ。
目だ。
どの目が出るかし
君のために踊ろうクイーン。
ら。これより演じるわ。荒波の再臨。
平穏
恐れなくていいさ。罪に向き合う。
この舞台の幕を下ろそう。
僕を最高の一品よ。
あなたに安らぎ
遅刻。
物語は始まったばかりだよ。
危な呼吸を整えよう。頭突き爆裂パワー。はーっとはーっとジャスティス。
不食神聖任せて。
合図を待てよな。頭突き超必殺ハンマードーン。突撃ドーン。ダイビングヒー
運命の変わり目。
最後の警告だ。
動け。イカズチ今やりづらい超必殺ハンマー見ててよ。
運命の変わり目。
呼吸を整えよう。合図を待つジャスティス。頭突きヒーロー決断。遅刻遅刻。
武器を捨てろ。
任せて。腐食神聖。
合図を待てよな。ジャスティス。
賢いやつだ。
ねえ怖いよ。ヒーロー決断。
賢いやつだ。
星とし無事今日の依頼。星としこの同点も 果物を育てるにはいろんなことを考えないといけないんだ。いい感じのタイミングで水やりと草むしりをしてあげて、鉱石の粉末で土に栄養を補給してあげて、温度も快適に保ってあげるの。でも一番大切なのはやっぱり果物たちの気持ちに寄り添うこと。
三月の月日の我が手
今だ。
剣女盤石
ギグ
神列が作る。
両をして傷つ
黎明の
けられる
光を。
難攻不落
雨なの瑠璃に月を映す。
洗い清めましょう。私を直視する
さあ洗い清めましょう。
わざと救い見せている
剣女盤石
映して
の黒
やっやっはっ行けはっ行けさあはっ
私
岩山八九
頼んだよ。
流れて聞く価値もない価格守る視線香よ。来たれ洗い清めましょう。は行けはは
お前は囚人だ。
生きて
灯火のもとに陰になる。
剣女盤石
三月よ輝く。あのなに瑠璃に月を映す。そこ
清めましょう。
この古臭い世界に妥協するというのか。
Too complicated.
Recently, a couple of days ago. So the details on this are not 100% clear just yet. So this is, an evolving story. There will probably be way more details on this in like a week, but I'm going to cover it as best as I can right now. So there was like an attempted terrorist attack / invasion by Miami Cubans of Cuba. You might have already heard about this. Initially, people tried to frame it as like murder or something, but it has become abundantly clear now that this was a group of armed people trying to attack Cuba by like infiltrating it on a fucking boat full of like weapons and stuff for who fucking knows what they had planned to do. I don't know if they thought they could start a revolution or they planned to do some terrorist attacks or whatever. This is an AP story. Let's see how they covered this. So their description is that the boat was stolen. It had 10 people aboard, loaded with weapons, and departed the Florida Keys. Got close to Cuba, was intercepted by the Coast Guard, and 4 of them were killed, and the commander of the Cuban Coast Guard boat was wounded. Now, this is not anything new. It has been on the down low in like the last 15-20 years or so, but Cuban exile terrorism is nothing new. To give you an example, there was a bombing of a Cuban passenger airliner in 1976 by a group of Cuban exile terrorists, and the ringleaders of this terrorist group then moved to the United States of America, where they died all and were never brought to any justice or were never extradited to Cuba for their crimes. So that's great, right? They blew up an airliner, killing 73 people. There was also a bombing of a hotel in Cuba in 1997, multiple hotels actually, by, get this, the same guy who had ordered and masterminded the plane bombing 20 years earlier. In a taped interview with the New York Times, he said, "It is sad that someone is dead, but we can't stop." Then he said he was reportedly disappointed with the reluctance of American news organizations to report on the bombing, saying, "If there is no publicity, the job is useless." So they bombed a bunch of hotels in Cuba, killed 1, injured 11 people. The ringleader was literally living in Florida at the time and nothing ever happened to him. He died in 2018 at age like 90. The American government never extradited him. He was just allowed to organize terrorist activities from Florida. So that there are Cuban exile terrorists in Florida attacking Cuba is sadly not new. But there's just mounting evidence that these guys had been planning this for a while. So one of the people who Cuba has said is in their custody posted 2 weeks ago on his Instagram a video in which he announced that he is the leader of an armed group and that he is ready to die to free Cuba. This is his account on Instagram, still up, Amigel Sanchez. This is the logo of his group, People Self-Defense. And his Instagram page is just full of like fires that have been lit in Cuba, like violence being committed by terrorists in Cuba. That rant was him condemning Cuban leaders in the US for not wanting to literally like do terrorism in Cuba like he does, like Cuban exile leaders rather. His social media accounts are full of images and videos involving armed conflict and envision attacks to bring down Cuba's regime. And he said he was ready to die to free Cuba and called exile leaders cowards. According to this article, the boat that they were on was stolen, and the owner reported stolen and said that one of the people who was reported to be on the boat by the Cuban government was his employee. So he stole the boat from his boss to try and invade and attack Cuba, this heavily armed group. And they were faced with one Coast Guard boat with 5 Cubans on it. Not even like soldiers, right? It's the Coast Guard, right? The Coast Guard isn't exactly heavily armed, especially not the Cuban Coast Guard. They don't deal with a lot of shit like this, but confronted with 5 Coast Guard guys, these 10 guys armed with the finest arms that you can get from American arms stores. 4 of them were killed. They only injured one of the Cuban Coast Guard, and the rest of them surrendered immediately. Well, this is not the Bay of Piglets, okay? We already have the Bay of Piglets. The Bay of Piglets happened in Venezuela in 2020, when basically a bunch of Americans tried to invade Venezuela to kill Maduro, and they were captured by random fishermen. That was contracted, by the way, by Juan Guaido. Like, Juan Guaido, the fake wannabe former Venezuelan president, self-declared president, like paid American former army guys to try and invade Venezuela, and they just got captured by random fishermen off the coast. But this right here can't be called the Bay of Piglets because that one was already the Bay of Piglets. So I'm calling this one the Granma Landing, named after the Granma Landing, where Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries landed in Cuba in November 1956 on a yacht called the Granma. And eventually, inside of the revolution, even though only about 20 of them, 15 of them survived, to the point that they overthrew the government. These guys were trying to do something similar, or maybe they were. We don't actually know if it was just terrorism, if they really so delusional to think they were going to overthrow the government. Like, they only about 20 of them, 15 of them survived, to the point that they overthrew the government. These guys were trying to do something similar, or maybe they were. We don't actually know if it was just terrorism, if they really so delusional to think they were going to overthrow the government, like in that style. But I'm going to call them the Grandma Landing. Because, gee golly gosh, it was so fucking shit. You gotta tell your grandma all about it. Or it was like a bunch of grannies trying to invade a country. Whatever way you want to interpret it. It was the Grandma Landing, okay? That's what it's called. The Grandma Landing. Because, gee golly gosh, it was so fucking shit. You gotta tell your grandma all about it. Or it was like a bunch of grannies trying to invade a country. Whatever way you want to interpret it. It was the Grandma Landing, okay? That's what it's called. There was like a bunch of other videos of these guys like posing with firearms and stuff. You can tell they were like American gun nuts who fancied themselves like tactical combat experts who genuinely thought they were gonna like do something amazing here. So according to NPR, which, you know, is not exactly a pro-Cuba news outlet, in fact, it's American government-funded media, one of the friends of these people confirmed to NPR that it was indeed an attempted terrorist attack. According to Michel Naranjo, this People's Self-Defense group has spent years recruiting Cubans to build what he described as a clandestine network aimed at sabotaging the Cuban government from within. Naranjo said he did not know Sanchez's specific plans, but added that he would have been proud to be on the boat. They are all men who want Cuba to be free, Naranjo told NPR. So, that's one of their friends just outright saying, yep, these were fucking guys trying to invade Cuba. I thought it was curious that, like, the American government's response was so muted. And the Cubans also said earlier that they were in contact with the US about this. Like, that Coast Guard talked to the American Coast Guard about what was happening before the boat even got there, before the firefight broke out. Like, asking them, like, who is this? What is this? Do you know about this? So, you know, the response has not been what I would have expected if it was like a false flag attempt or something. So maybe the government wasn't involved. But then you have to ask the question, like, how'd they get past the American Coast Guard? You know? How did a fucking boat loaded with 10 guys full of weapons get past the American Coast Guard no problem? That doesn't really seem like a likely thing, especially when the Cubans were talking to them about the potential for this boat to cause trouble the whole way through. Very weird there. I mean, I guess they could just be incompetent. That is possible. Or maybe they happened to, like, slip through at a part where there were no, like, Coast Guard monitoring or any interception capacity. Or maybe they just didn't care. Who knows? But that's the only really suspicious thing. Like, Marco Rubio came out with a really, really weirdly muted statement, which makes me think this was not a false flag, but was rather like a thing that was independently organized by, like, the Cuban exile fascists in Miami. I mean, I could be wrong. We'll wait and see what the Cubans have to say about it in the coming weeks. So a Cuban exile news outlet called Cibercuba posted an article where they state that family members of some of the men who died or were captured said that they were training for this on a ranch in the south of Florida. And they organized through social networks like TikTok. You know, terrorists in America organize on fucking TikTok, and the, you know, 100% like the FBI's auto detection algorithms detected this and they did nothing about it. You can bet your fucking anything on that. If it was like pro-Palestine people doing the same thing, they would have been there in 2 seconds, but they clearly just let this one through the cracks. They organize on TikTok. Jesus Christ.
難攻不落。隙あり。岩山八九。行け。難攻不落。映して三月よ輝け。そう熱よ。
So they trained on a ranch in South Florida, according to the family members. And then they stole a speedboat, and they just got immediately captured and fucked. As you would expect, when, like, American-style gun nuts face the fucking reality of people who actually are professionals and know what they're doing, even slightly. I just want to point out, by the way that, like, the Cuban exile American politicians and leaders and such frame this initially is so fucking hilarious. SOS Cuba! The Cuban dictatorship just attacked a boat from Florida, and they have murdered the people on board. Oh man. Help! We tried to invade another country, heavily armed, and do a terrorist attack. We have been murdered. The regime people on board. Oh, a boat from Florida, and they have murdered the people on board. Oh man. Help! We tried to invade another country, heavily armed, and do a terrorist attack. We have been murdered. The regime must be relegated to the dustbin of history, says Representative Carlos A. Jimenez, U.S. Congressman, Armed Services, Homeland Security, and Select Committee on China. Oh man. So yeah, we'll see how this story develops, but to me, it already seems really obvious what happened here. It was like another attempt at Cuban exile terrorism, as Cuban exiles have been doing for many, many years now. The fact that even the American government didn't just come out and immediately try to, like, weaponize this against the Cuban government, even at this point of extremely heightened attacks on Cuba, I think really speaks to the fact that that's what it was. They might still weaponize it later, who knows, but, like, the only real people trying to do that have been the generic Florida congressmen and such, and the senators and such, rather than the actual national government of the US, which says something in my opinion. We'll wait and see what kind of details come out, but this just seems like thankfully thwarted attempt at a terrorist attack launched from American soil that doubtlessly had Americans who are still in America who are complicit in it, none of whom is going to face any consequences, of course. Because what always happens is the US is a base for terrorism against Cuba. The US accuses Cuba of being a state sponsor of terrorism, while they literally have people launching terrorist attacks against Cuba for decades upon decades upon decades, and they do nothing about it. Fucking joke. So after I recorded this, Cuba actually came out and released a ton more information on what happened. Like, they showed the guns that these people had brought with them, all the weapons and such, all their equipment. They also shared, like, the serial numbers of the weapons, which I'm sure are going to be traceable to, like, gun stores in the USA and stuff like that. So if you want to read more details on what happened now that it's come out, go to cubadebate.cu. They have an article there, and I'll also have the article linked in the description down below. You can right-click, translate it in your browser, or however your browser translates, and you'll be able to read it just fine.
The Red Line document calculated exactly how many calories were needed to keep Palestinians in Gaza on a diet without causing outright mass starvation. This was a very cold calculation of the maximum amount of misery Israel could mete out on the Palestinian people without facing too much international resistance. Now, let's compare the Red Lines document to Memorandum 499, issued by the US State Department in 1960. In that document, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Lester D. Mallory noted that the Cuban Revolution was extremely popular among the Cuban people and lacked an effective internal opposition. The conclusion of Memorandum 499 was that the only way to alienate the people from their government was through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. The memo states explicitly that if the above are accepted or cannot be successfully countered, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. This has been the official policy of the United States since 1960, to carry out the systematic privation and starvation of the people of Cuba as inconspicuously as possible. To make the people of Cuba go hungry, to instill misery in the civilian population by denying the very necessities of life. The embargo against Cuba has since been used as a template for starving and collectively punishing the peoples of countless other nations, including Venezuela and Iran, and including Vietnam. My partner, Luna, runs the channel Luna Oi. She has a whole video. It's actually a two-part series talking about growing up under comprehensive embargoes in the 90s. If you want an idea of what it's like to be a child growing up under comprehensive embargo, go watch those videos. It's heartbreaking. And one of the only countries that helped the people of Vietnam during that embargo was Cuba. Luna would probably not be alive today if it weren't for Cuban medicines and vaccines and medical aid that was delivered to the people of Vietnam through the comprehensive economic embargo, which the USA was cruelly imposing on Vietnam all the way up into the 2000s. The Center for Economic Policy and Research issued a report in 2019 on sanctions against Venezuela, which found that most of the impact of these sanctions has not been on the government, but on the civilian population. The sanctions reduced the public's caloric intake, increased disease and mortality for both adults and infants, and displaced millions of Venezuelans who fled the country as a result of the worsening economic depression and hyperinflation. They exacerbated Venezuela's economic crisis and made it nearly impossible to stabilize the economy, contributing further to excess deaths. All of these impacts disproportionately harmed the poorest and most vulnerable Venezuelans. Even more severe and destructive than the broad economic sanctions of August 2017 were the sanctions imposed by executive order on January 28, 2019, and subsequent executive orders this year, and the recognition of a parallel government, which is shown below, created a whole new set of financial and trade sanctions that are even more constricting than the executive orders themselves. We find that the sanctions have inflicted and increasingly inflict very serious harm to human life and health, including an estimated more than 40,000 deaths from 2017 to 2018, and that these sanctions would fit the definition of collective punishment of the civilian population as described in both the Geneva and Hague International Conventions, to which the USA is a signatory. They are also illegal under international law and treaties which the US has signed, and would appear to violate US law as well. There is nothing complicated about this. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity, and the United States of America is a signatory to this fact. And of course, Iran faces similar civilian strangling sanctions, and right now, the United States is threatening to go even farther in its attack against the Iranian people. We, as American citizens, are being asked to consent to the potential of an all-out war against the nation of Iran. And why? Because Iran has been one of the few nations which has directly struggled in opposition to the genocide in Palestine. Because like Venezuela, the United States is threatening to go even farther in its attack against the Iranian people. We, as American citizens, are being asked to consent to the potential of an all-out war against the nation of Iran. And why? Because Iran has been one of the few nations which has directly struggled in opposition to the genocide in Palestine. Because like Venezuela, Iran nationalized its own oil industry, and for more spurious reasons, such as Iran's supposed nuclear weapons program. Mind you, as we've explained in previous videos, this nuclear weapons program has never been proven to exist. And even if it did, Trump swore up and down last year that he had completely obliterated that supposed nuclear weapons program with his last bombing campaign against Iran. So as with all the previous imperialist interventions in wars, it's all bullshit. It's all completely contradictory to reality, to truth. And the media, social media platforms, all these different corporate propaganda outlets are tasked by the ruling class with constructing an invented reality in our minds in which Iran is some kind of supervillain nation that's building super weapons which it wants to use against the USA, or somehow the struggling, impoverished island nation of Cuba is somehow a threat to the USA. These statements are not true in the real world, so the capitalists have to create a fantasy world that we all live in through our phone screens and through our TV screens, in which these preposterous imaginings are somehow taken as truth by the working class. So I think it's important that we now take a look at some of the common lines of propaganda used to invent realities which fool workers into consenting to unnecessary, unjust war. First of all, the suffering of civilians, which is directly caused by sanctions and embargoes and asset seizures and bombings, is always blamed on the governments of the victimized nations. Sanctions, embargoes, blockades, these things are explicitly intended to bring about hunger and desperation. In their own words, that's what they're for. Then, when this hunger and desperation is successfully developed by the aggressor, once the people, the civilians, are starving and miserable, capitalist media goes on to describe the outcome as a human rights crisis caused by government mismanagement. Remember, this exact argument was long used to justify the starvation of Palestinians. We've been told time and time again that the suffering, the hunger, the privation of Palestinians is the result of the poor leadership and mismanagement of Palestinian resistance groups. Even though it is a documented fact that that hunger and the humanitarian crisis was the intended outcome of documented Israeli colonial policy. And here's another parallel between Israeli propaganda and American imperialist propaganda: the use of the passive voice. In the capitalist media, violence against Palestinians and Cubans and Venezuelans and Iranians often lacks an actor. So in Palestine, people die of malnutrition. In Cuba, the economy collapses. In Venezuela, the economy fails to recover. And this might sound familiar because another place to see this propaganda tactic used all the time is in American domestic propaganda. You know, like when the cops in the USA take someone out in cold blood, the headlines are always saying that the victim died in a police-involved shooting or some shit like that. That's the same principle. You remove the subject of the sentence. You use passive voice. Create a cognitive barrier between your audience and reality. So we really need to take it upon ourselves to teach our fellow workers and to remind each other and ourselves that these problems we're seeing in these targeted nations are not just like organic outcomes that happen naturally because of poor leadership. These are the outcomes of active choices made by the USA and Israel. The US Treasury actively threatens international banks that process Cuban transactions. The IDF actively blocks caloric intake to Gaza. By removing the subject from the sentence, the propaganda machine frames intentional atrocity against civilians as pure happenstance. Or worse yet, it blames the victims of the violence without mentioning the actions of the perpetrators which carried out the violence. It's classic Darvo, deny, attack, reverse, victim, offender. We talk about that all the time on this channel. It's an imperialist go-to. And the goal of imperialist Darvo is to convince the workers of the world that the suffering of these people, of these targeted civilians, is proof somehow that they're incapable of leading themselves, that they need the USA and or Israel to come in and take over and, patronizingly protect them from themselves. If a key is it blames the victims of the violence without mentioning the actions of the perpetrators which carried out the violence. It's classic Darvo, deny, attack, reverse, victim, offender. We talk about that all the time on this channel. It's an imperialist go-to. And the goal of imperialist Darvo is to convince the workers of the world that the suffering of these people, of these targeted civilians, is proof somehow that they're incapable of leading themselves, that they need the USA and or Israel to come in and take over and, patronize civilians is proof somehow world channel. It's an imperialist go-to. And the goal of imperialist Darvo is to convince the workers of the world that the suffering of these people, of these targeted civilians, is proof somehow that they're incapable of leading themselves, that they need the USA and or Israel to come in and take over and, patronizingly protect them from themselves. If a Cuban protect them from themselves. If a Cuban hospital runs out of antibiotics due to the U.S. state sponsor of terrorism list designation that Cuba's been placed on, capitalist media pundits will proclaim that this is evidence that socialism doesn't work and communism is evil and we need to get rid of the communist government. They do the exact same thing in Palestine. Like, they'll destroy all the schools and hospitals, and then they'll say, oh, look, the Palestinian children aren't going to school. There's no adequate health care. Palestine is incompetent at governing. In both of these cases, the empire destroys the infrastructure, and then they use the rubble as evidence of the victims. In exact same thing in Palestine. Like, they'll destroy all the schools and hospitals, and then they'll say, oh, look, the Palestinian children aren't going to school. There's no adequate health care. Palestine is incompetent at governing. In both of these cases, the empire destroys the infrastructure, and then they use the rubble as evidence of the victims' incompetence. And again, this happens domestically. We see it all the time. We see minorities systematically, racially oppressed. They are not given economic opportunities. And then the social problems that result of that poverty, which is systematically imposed on them by the capitalist caste system of white supremacy, that gets blamed on those groups. Deny, attack, reverse, victim, offender. It's a classic capitalist propaganda line. And similarly, both the USA and Israel justify barbaric economic warfare, these sanctions, these blockades, these embargoes, by invoking a permanent state of emergency.
特有の力を思い知りなさい。
止める勇気はあるか。石煙に葬られよ。そろそろ本全力攻撃。
手加減なしよ。ヒトラリいつとか買おうよ。
この天下で裁く。私と共に夜に落ちまして。解放してあげる。どよめく進学、火炎を刻め。
口封じは任せたからね。
Israel justify barbaric economic warfare, these sanctions, these blockades, these embargoes, by invoking a permanent state of emergency. They create a security necessity narrative to protect the Western Hemisphere from hostile influence, despite the fact that Cuba has not participated in any hostilities anywhere in the world in many security necessity narrative to protect the Western Hemisphere from hostile influence, despite the fact that Cuba has not participated in any hostilities anywhere in the world in many, many decades since before I was born. Iran is listed as a security threat for having a nuclear weapons program, which has never been documented to exist, and which, like we said earlier, a security necessity narrative to protect the Western Hemisphere from hostile influence, despite the fact that Cuba has not participated in any hostilities anywhere in the world in many, many decades since before I was born. Iran is listed as invoking a permanent state of emergency. They create a security necessity narrative to protect the Western Hemisphere from hostile influence, despite the fact that Cuba has not participated in any hostilities anywhere in the world in many, many decades since before I was born. Iran is listed as a security threat for having a nuclear weapons program, which has never been documented to exist, and which, like we said earlier, was supposedly completely obliterated a few months ago. And I have a whole video about how liberals actually started manufacturing consent for more war against Iran right away. As soon as that happened, you can see a link in the description if you want to check that out to see more about how this line of propaganda works. By framing the importation of food, of human needs, of medicine as a security risk, the empire makes the denial of life-sustaining goods appear like a defensive measure rather than an offensive strike against the civilian population of these nations. If you think that it's preposterous to call the Israeli settler colonists the indigenous resistance and call the Palestinian people who are getting genocided the oppressors, you should think it's equally ridiculous to call Cuba the oppressive aggressors that the USA needs to continue starving en masse for our own protection as Americans. It's as absurd. It's equally as absurd as the Israeli propaganda line used against Palestinians. And importantly, it serves the same function of protecting capitalism, of furthering the agenda of the capitalist class, of expanding the empire. Another extension of these Darvo tactics is the "it's for their own good" line of propaganda. We're expected to believe that Palestinians and Cubans and Iranians somehow benefit from being stuck, how the ruling regime of target nations are ontologically evil. Somehow the USA is not ontologically evil, but these countries are, and therefore the USA is helping them out. They're helping the civilians by bombing them and starving them. These nations need to be mass murdered for their own good. It's a really ghoulish argument, and if you stop and think it through even for a moment, it absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. Iran is perhaps the most important example here because the supreme leader of Iran has a lot of mega shitty domestic policies. Objectively not a good dude, but almost every government sucks. I mean, look around the world. There are a lot of really shitty governments out there doing a lot of really shitty things. The governments of Saudi Arabia and the UAE are arguably worse than Iran's government, but our ruling class never tries to justify mass murder of their civilian populations. How the hell does bombing and starving the people of Iran help them in any way whatsoever? How are they supposed to have this revolution they need to have against the supreme leader if they can't even eat? Do you really think that if the USA goes to war with Iran, it's going to help the people there? Do you think that any government they build is going to be better? The USA has never once succeeded in nation building. Every place we have ever invaded has fallen into chaos and suffering that far exceeded what was going on before we showed up. 1 million people in Iraq died at least. This entire lie is rooted in the monstrous arrogance of American hypernationalism. In truth, the USA does not have any business in policing other nations. We need to police ourselves. And if you buy into this notion at this point that we're bombing and starving people for their own good, I'm sorry, but you are so gullible and foolish that you are a danger to yourself and others. We don't know what's best for Iran. We don't have the capability to save Iran. And the ruling class of the USA has no interest in helping Iran. The ruling class just wants to plunder and exploit Iran. And that's all there is to it. And that goes quadruple for Cuba and Palestine, nations which have never even had a chance to try and build themselves up peacefully because they've been under constant assault for generations. It is infuriating that we've done nothing but hinder, harm, and kill the people of these nations since long before I was born. Then we turn around and we act like we're the good guys, and we blame them for not blossoming into perfect utopias. Being an American is thinking we have the responsibility to go around and overthrow governments all around the world when we ourselves live in a brutal, incompetent, aggressive, unjust, prejudice-ridden police state that's run by a corrupt pedophile ring. We should be a lot more concerned with our own government than the governments of these other nations. So you can just all the way off if you think you are in any position to judge Cuba or Iran or Venezuela. All this madness, the wars and the constant aggression against the people of these nations that have not harmed the USA in any way, the genocide against the people of Palestine, these are all manifestations of the same class warfare against all of us as workers. As activists and organizers in the Imperial Corps, we must draw these parallels. We must connect the struggles of ourselves as a working class in the USA to the struggles of our comrades in these other nations that are being imperialized and attacked and devastated on our behalf. We have got to get it through our heads that this is the same capitalist, imperialist ruling class that is united in attacking all of us, in all of these nations, in the targeted nations and in the empire. The USA and Israel both have the same ambitions of wiping out opposition and stamping out any and all resistance against colonial occupation of these supposed enemies. And meanwhile, they're oppressing us back at home. We're losing any semblance of civil rights we ever had. American activists are getting shot down in the streets right now. As a citizen of the USA, I refuse to consent to the framing of these sovereign nations as my enemy. Cuba's not my enemy. Iran's not my enemy. Venezuela's not my enemy. And I also proclaim here and now that my allegiance is not to the nation which I was born a citizen of, but to the global working class that I labor with and that I am oppressed with by the violent, ruling, capitalist, imperialist class that is attacking and targeting all these other nations right now and targeting and attacking my own people back at home. The way I see it, public enemy number one, the threat to myself and my fellow workers around the world and in the USA is the USA. The USA threatens peace and stability for all of us everywhere. Right now, as Cuba is facing a desperate humanitarian crisis thanks to these ramped up fuel embargoes, and Marco Rubio has stated a goal of regime change in Cuba by the end of this year, as Iran is surrounded and threatened by an American fleet of warships, and as Venezuela is occupied and strangled and subjugated by American oil corporations, it's urgent that we merge the energy of the Palestine Solidarity Movement with the struggle to end all imperialist war everywhere into one single, unified peace movement. We can do this just as we did with Palestine. We have to educate ourselves on the history and the current conditions of victim nations like Iran and Venezuela and Cuba, So we are able to immediately counter the "it's complicated" narrative with the hard and simple facts. They're going to trot out compradors and human rights experts. They're going to talk about the poor management of Cuba and Iran and the plight and the suffering. And it's all going to be in service of convincing you that the USA can, should, and must go and attack these nations, invade these nations, starve the people of these nations. Every time they mention poverty in Gaza, point to the Red Lines document. Every time they talk about poverty and suffering in Cuba, point to Memorandum 499. Learn to counter these propaganda. Point of the people of these nations. Every time they mention poverty in Gaza, point to the Red Lines document. Every time they talk about poverty and suffering in Cuba, point to Memorandum 499. Learn to counter these propaganda narratives. It is vital that you do so. Talk about poverty and suffering in Cuba, point to Memorandum 499. Learn to counter these propaganda. Point to the Red Line. Every time they mention poverty in Gaza, point to the Red Lines document. Every time they mention invade these nations, starve the people of these nations, every time they mention poverty in Gaza, point to the Red Lines document. Every time they talk about poverty and suffering in Cuba, point to Memorandum 499. Learn to counter these propaganda narratives. It is vital that you do so and that you teach your fellow workers to do so. I'm proud that all of us, including myself, have learned to struggle and strike for the people of Palestine. We have to do the same thing now for the people of Cuba and Iran and Venezuela. We have to get proud that all of us, including myself, have learned to struggle and to do so. I'm proud that all of us, including myself, have learned to struggle and strike for the people of Palestine. We have to do the same thing now for the people of Cuba and Iran and Venezuela. We have to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. We have to end the confrontation with Iran. We have to get the blood-stained hands of Western oil tycoons off of Venezuela. All these fights are one and the same. When we protest at a weapons manufacturing plant that's making bombs for Israel, we're also protesting the entity that enforces the blockade on Havana or threatens Iran with carrier groups. Our movement must reflect the reality that all these nations are being attacked and imperialized for the same reasons. We have to stop collective punishment and siege warfare against civilians in Cuba and Palestine Iran and Venezuela and everywhere else it happens. And I'm just using those as examples. There are a lot more nations where this shit's happening, you know, and we need to learn about all the different places it's happening. And I'm especially speaking right now to my fellow citizens of the empire which carries out this violence, especially folks in the USA. We cannot rely on China or Russia or any other nation to save Cuba or Palestine or any other victim of our empire. Speaking to my fellow citizens of the USA, we have the greatest power and the greatest responsibility to stand for Palestine, for Cuba, and for every other nation which is under attack by the United States empire. Nobody has more power to do something about these crimes against humanity than we do if we're citizens of the USA. We have to stand up to our own government. We have to teach our fellow workers in the USA that we have a lot more common with a worker in Iran or Venezuela or Cuba than we do with these billionaire pedophiles who run our country. We have to free the world, not just Palestine, the entire world from capitalist imperialism. It's all one struggle, and none of us are free until all of us are free. I'm EJ. This is Non-Compete. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.
So whenever something big happens, particularly something really big, like a war that will change world history, the first four questions you have to ask are these. 1, why did this happen? 2, what was the point of it? 3, where does it go from here? And 4, how do we respond? So let's assess the war in Iran, now ongoing in its second day, and try to answer those 4 questions. First, why did this happen? Now, in this case, there's a really simple answer. This happened because Israel wanted it to happen. This is Israel's war. This is not the United States' war. This war is not being waged on behalf of American national security objectives to make the United States safer or richer. This war is not actually even about weapons of mass destruction, nukes, chem bio. No, this war is waged purely because Israel wanted it to be waged. Now, why say that out loud this early in the conflict? Isn't that dispiriting for, say, American troops fighting this war? Yes, it is. And we thought a lot about whether it was wise or decent even to say something like that out loud, and have decided that it is for the following reason. First, because the truth is always the only basis for wise decision-making. When you lie to yourself or you lie to your people, fighting this war, yes, it is. And we thought a lot wanted it to be waged. Now, why say that out loud this early in the conflict? Isn't that dispiriting for, say, American troops fighting this war? Yes, it is. And we thought a lot about whether it was wise or decent even to say something like that out loud, and have decided that it is for the following reason. First, because the truth is always the only basis for wise decision-making. When you lie to yourself or you lie to your people, you not only commit, well, a kind of moral crime by lying, but you also tend to hurt yourself. Hubris is the product of lies, for example. can get way over your skis if you're not honest with yourself and the people around you about what's happening and why it's happening. But long term, that is also true. In other words, it's important to say why this war is happening because 50 years from now, people may not know. Your grandkids may learn that this war started because the Ayatollah showed up in Miami and started machine gunning people in a shopping mall, and so we responded. There was a kind of Iranian Pearl Harbor. You don't know what the future will believe about the present. You don't know how history will be written. And if you're skeptical of that, if you're asking yourself, well, how could historians, popular historians, how could future culture so misunderstand something so big? How could people lie about something so obvious, so giant? Well, history is your guide. A lot of the big events we think we understand, including wars from the past and not so distant past, are completely distorted in our memories. In other words, that's not actually what happened at all. And the truth is, if enough people lie about something at a high enough volume, and they do it for long enough, loudly enough, while threatening anyone who refuses to lie about it, over time, their lies become conventional wisdom. Everyone believes them. There is something about repeating a lie over and over and over again that's almost like a spell or an incantation. It's almost a form of witchcraft. It assumes reality, or a version of reality, an ersatz reality, a fake reality, but reality nevertheless. And if you're interested at all in history, going back thousands of years or even more recently, you know that the understandings of certain events that you grew up hearing about probably totally inverted. The opposite is true, but you didn't know that until you dug a little deeper, in some cases a lot deeper, to find out because they have been distorted in the retelling. And because they have been, because a lot of our most basic assumptions are based on untruths, we wind up getting into the same messes again and again. So it's just important to tell the truth about this now in the early stages. This is, by the way, widely known. This is not a conspiracy theory. Everyone's saying it out loud now because it's true. The United States committed troops to this conflict because the prime minister of Israel, not Israel as a nation, but the guy who runs it, Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, demanded it. 7 trips to the White House over the last year. And the point of those trips never varied. The United States needs to commit to regime change in Iran. We need the U.S. military to overthrow the government of Iran. And Bibi himself has basically said that it wasn't that we thought Iran was going to get nukes this week, and that's why we did this. Nobody's even saying that now. They will be in the future when our memories get a little dimmer and they can manipulate us more. But right now they're admitting, no, actually they were not on the verge of getting nukes. Bibi himself said, you can pull up the video, I've been dreaming about this for 40 years. We've finally done it. So this is the culmination of a long time plan, of strategy. And actually, if you look at it backwards and try to assess recent events, even in this country, in American political life over the past several years, certainly over the past 6 or 8 months, you can see that a lot of what was happening here was preparation for where we are right now. In other words, people who wanted war in Iran were softening up the public for it, were manipulating the U.S. government in order to affect it, and were doing their very best to silence anyone who doubted its wisdom. A lot of the things we have seen in the recent past are, and now it's very obvious, they were all designed to get us to where we are now, war with Iran on behalf of Israel. Now, just a caveat at the outset, just because the prime minister of Israel wanted a regime change war with Iran does not mean in any sense that it was a wise idea for Israel. It certainly wasn't a good idea for the United States. No one just really disputes that. But was it a good idea for the country or for the prime minister who advocated for it? No, probably not, actually. Just because we want something doesn't mean it's good for us. Sometimes when we get what we want most, we're destroyed by it. Hope that doesn't happen to Israel, of course, or anybody. But it could. So when you get to the truth of things and you see who's pushing for them, that doesn't mean that person understands his own best interest or is who's destroyed by it. Hope that doesn't happen to Israel, of course, or anybody. But it could. So when you get to the truth of things and you see who's pushing for them, that doesn't mean that person understands his own best interest or his country's own best interest. Often they don't. Often we don't. But it doesn't change the fact that we got here because Israel lobbied for it. And virtually everyone in the U.S. government, certainly in the Pentagon, understood the risks. The risks were obvious from day one. First, if you knock off a government, we have a long history of doing that. It's not that hard.